There were two women in Zhenbao's life. One he called his white rose, the other his red rose. One was a spotless wife, the other a passionate mistress. Isn't that just how the average man describes a chaste widow's devotion to her husband's memory, as spotless and passionate too? Maybe every man has had two such women, at least two. Marry a red rose and eventually she'll be a mosquito blood streak smeared on the wall, while the white one is moonlight in front of my bed. Marry a white rose and before long she'll be a grain of sticky rice that's gotten stuck to your clothes. The red one by then is a scarlet beauty mark just over your heart. But Zhenbao wasn't like that. He was logical and thorough. He was, in this respect, the ideal modern Chinese man. If he did bump into something that was less than ideal, he bounced it around in his mind for a while and poof, it was idealized. Then everything fell into place. Zhenbao had launched his career the proper way, by going to the West to get his degree and factory training. He was smart and well-educated, and having worked his way through school, he had the energy and determination of a self-made man. Now he held an upper-level position in a well-known foreign textile company. His wife was a university graduate, and she came from a good family. She was gentle and pretty, and she'd never been a party girl. One daughter, age 9, already they'd made plans for her college tuition. Never had a son been more filial, more considerate than Zhenbao was to his mother. Never was a brother more thoughtful or helpful to his siblings. At work, he was the most hard-working and devoted of colleagues. To his friends, the kindest, truest, and most generous of men. Zhenbao's life was a complete success. If he had believed in reincarnation, he didn't. He'd have hoped simply to pick up a new name, then come back and live the same life all over again. Rich idlers laughed at Zhenbao and called him vulgar. Literary youths and progressive types did too. But since he was vulgar in a Western way, they didn't really hold it against him. Zhenbao wasn't tall, but he was vigorous and quick. He had a soy-brown face and wore black-rimmed glasses, with something peculiarly unresolved in his facial expression. His posture was excellent, and he didn't joke around, unless, that is, it was appropriate joke. He seemed frank and open, a man you could take in at a glance, and if you couldn't quite pinpoint the sincerity in his eyes, those eyeglasses were proof enough. Zhenbao came from a poor family. If he hadn't struggled to rise in the world, he probably would have had to stand behind a counter in a shop, and then his whole existence would have been one tiny round of ignorance and stupidity. Instead, starting in on his new job after his studies abroad, his window opened up on the whole world. He had plenty of opportunities to look forward to, and the benefits of an unfettered mind. An amazing degree of freedom, all in all. And yet, the average man's life, no matter how good, is only a peach blossom fan. Like the loyal beleaguered beauty in the story, you bang your head and blood drips on the fan. Add a few strokes of ink and the bloodstain becomes a peach blossom. Zhenbao's fan was still blank, but he had a dry brush, a wetting stone, a sunny window, and a clean table, all just waiting for him to lower his brush and begin. That blank fan did have some hazy figures in the background, like the images of people in old-fashioned clothes that one sees printed in light purple ink on elegant mock antique stationery. Before the wife and mistress, there had been two insignificant women. The first was a Paris whore. Zhenbao had studied textile manufacturing at a school in Edinburgh. Poor students don't have a chance to see much when abroad, and all that Zhenbao remembered of Britain was the underground, cabbage, fog, hunger, and stuffing himself sick. As for things like opera, not until he returned home to Shanghai did he have an opportunity to see a Russian company perform. But one summer he'd laid out some money, taken off some time, and gone on a tour of the continent. When he got to Paris, naturally he wanted to see how very naughty the Parisians were, except that he didn't have any friends who knew the town well enough to show him around. He couldn't afford and didn't want that kind of friend, so he plunged in all on his own, afraid of what it might cost, afraid of being cheated too. One evening in Paris he found himself with nothing to do. He'd eaten supper early and was walking to his lodgings in a quiet back street. "And all my friends will think that I've really seen Paris," he said to himself, almost plaintively. The street lamps had already been lit, but overhead the sun still shone, dropping bit by bit down to the roofs of the square cement buildings, dropping further and further. The shimmering white of the roofs seemed to be crumbling away. Jumbao walked down the street feeling forlorn. In one of the houses, someone was playing a piano with one hand, picking out the notes. Christmas songs played very slowly, one after another. Christmas carols are joyful on Christmas Eve, but this was a summer afternoon on a long, quiet street flooded with sunlight. The timing felt all wrong, like a dream so mixed up and meaningless that it was almost funny. Jumbao didn't know why, but he couldn't bear the sound of that one-finger melody. He picked up his pace. His hands started to sweat in his pocket. He walked quickly, but then the woman in front of him, wearing a black dress, slowed down. She turned her head just a bit and gave him a glance. She was wearing a red slip under her black lace dress. Jumbao liked red lingerie. He hadn't realized that a woman of this sort would be in this neighborhood, with a little hotel nearby. Years later, when Jumbao was telling the story to his friends, he would adopt a mocking manner, happy but a tad rueful. "Before I went to Paris," he'd say, "I was just a boy. I really ought to go back someday, for old time's sake." The memory should have been a romantic one, but oddly enough he couldn't recall any of the romantic parts, only the upsetting ones. Foreigners always have more body odor than Chinese people do. This woman couldn't stop worrying about it. He noticed how she'd half-consciously raise one arm and turn her head to sniff. The armpits of her clothing were sprayed with perfume, cheap perfume mixed with armpit odor, and sour sweat made for a strange smell that he couldn't get out of his head. But what he hated most was her constant worrying. When she came out of the bathroom in her slip, she rested her hand high on the wall, tilted her head to the side, and smiled at him. But he knew that at some level she was sniffing herself. Even with a woman like this, though he could spend money on her, he couldn't be her master. The half hour he spent with her filled him with shame. There was another detail he could never forget. She was putting her clothes back on, pulling her dress over her head, and when she was half there, with the fabric still piled up around her shoulders, she stopped for a moment as if she'd thought of something. Right then he saw her in the mirror. She had a mass of tousled blonde hair pulled tight by the dress so that only her long, thin face showed. Her eyes were blue, a blue that ran down into the shadows under her eyes, while the eyes themselves were like two transparent glass balls. It was a cold, severe, masculine face, the face of an ancient warrior. Jumbao was badly shaken. When he came out, the sun was still shining, with the shadows of the trees lying crooked in the sunlit street. This too was not right. It was terrifying. Whoring can be sleazy, low-class, filthy, miserable, and it won't matter. That just makes it all the earthier. But it wasn't like that, not this time. Later, when Jumbao had figured out how to get what he wanted out of a whore, he'd think back to that time in Paris, his first time, when he'd been a fool. Now he was the master of his world. From that day on, Jumbao was determined to create a world that was right, and to carry it with him wherever he went. In that little pocket-sized world of his, he was the absolute master. Jumbao lived in England for a considerable time. His factory internship paid a stipend, and he rustled up odd jobs on the side. Once he'd made himself a bit more comfortable, financially speaking, he acquired a few girlfriends. He was a nice fellow, and he wanted to meet a nice girl, not some prostitute. But he was also a busy man who couldn't spend lots of time on courting. Naturally, he liked girls who were a little more forthright. There were only a few Chinese girls in Edinburgh, two of them classmates who hailed from the inland provinces. He found them too affected, too churchy, altogether too pious. Nowadays, the churches have become something of a social scene, with quite a few beauties on display, but 10 years ago, the fervent churchgoers who had love in their hearts weren't, in fact, lovely. The lively ones were the overseas Chinese. Mixed-blood girls went even farther. Jumbao met a girl named Rose. She was his first love, which is why he also likened his two later women to roses. Rose's father was a good-looking English businessman, who'd lived in southern China for many years and then, thanks to a passing fancy, married a Cantonese girl and brought her home to Edinburgh. The wife had to be living in the house still, but she was practically invisible and never took part in social events. Rose attended an English school, and because she wasn't completely English, she acted more English than the English themselves. The English students liked to affect a certain dashing indifference, and when something really important was at stake, the affectation grew even stronger. Jianbao couldn't figure out whether or not Rose really loved him. He, for his part, was rather dazzled. They both liked to do things fast, and on Saturday nights they made the rounds of different dance halls. When they weren't out on the dance floor, but just sitting around and talking, Rose never seemed to pay much attention. She'd take out some matches and try to balance a glass on top of them. Jianbao was supposed to help. That was Rose, solemn as could be when she was horsing around. There was a canary at her place, and whenever it sang, she thought it was calling to her. "Yes, bird?" She'd answer right off, standing on tiptoe with her hands behind her back and her face tilted up toward the birdcage. Her tanned face was long, not round like a child's, but at such moments she seemed remarkably childlike. She'd gaze wide-eyed at the bird in the cage, the whites of her eyes tinged blue, as if she were staring into deep blue skies. Rose may have been the most ordinary of girls, but her very youth made her remarkably hard to read. Like that canary, calling out but not really saying anything to anyone. Her short skirt ended above her knees and her legs were light and nimble, as delicately made as wooden legs in a shop window. Her skin was as smooth and glistening as freshly planed and oiled wood. Her hair was cut very short, shaved down to a little point at the nape of her neck. No hair to protect her neck, no sleeves to protect her arms. Rose did not watch her words, and her body was open for the taking. She was carefree with Jianbao, and he put that down to her being innocent. But her being so carefree with everyone struck him as slightly nutty. This kind of woman was common enough in foreign countries, but in China it would never do. Marrying her, then transplanting her to his hometown, that would be a big waste of time and money. Not a good deal at all. One evening he drove her home, as he often did. But this time it seemed different because he was going to leave England soon, and if he had had anything to say, he should have said it by now. He hadn't. Her house was quite far from town. The faint black and white of the late-night road patted their faces like a powder puff. The conversation in the car was desultory in the English fashion, starting and stopping again. Rose knew that she had already lost him. Then, out of some kind of hopeless obstinacy, her heart caught fire. "Stop here," she said, when they had almost reached her house. "I don't want to let my family see us saying goodbye." "I'd kiss you even in front of them," Jianbao said, smiling. He reached out to wrap his arm around her shoulder, and she buried her face into his chest. The car kept going. They were well past her house before it stopped. Jianbao slid his hand under her velvet coat and pulled her toward him. Behind her aching cold diamonds, crinkly silver lace, hundreds of exquisite nuisances, her young body seemed to leap out of her clothes. Jianbao kissed her, and tears streamed over her face till neither of them could tell who was crying. Outside the car, a damp, limitless fog floated in the wind. Its emptiness sapped their strength, and all they could do was hang on to each other. Rose clung to his neck, this way then that, trying to pull ever closer, wishing she could fuse her body with his, press herself into it. Jianbao was so confused that he couldn't think. He had never dreamed that Rose loved him so much. He could have done whatever he wanted, but this would not do. Rose, after all, was a decent girl. This sort of thing was not for him. Rose's body leapt out of her clothes, leapt onto his body, but he was his own master. Afterward, even he was surprised by his self-control. He'd hardened his heart and taken Rose home. Just before he left, he held her moist face with its sniffles and tears and quivering eyelashes that fluttered in his palms like some tiny winged creature. In later days, he'd recall this experience whenever he needed to rally his strength. If you could control yourself then, in that situation, surely you can do so now. His behavior that evening filled him with an astonishment and admiration, and yet in his heart he felt regret. Without admitting it, he felt quite a lot of regret. He seldom mentioned the incident, but there was not one of his friends who was unaware of Zhenbao's reputation as a regular Xujiahui, a man who could keep perfectly calm with a beautiful woman in his lap. Word had gotten around. Zhenbao's grades were excellent, and before he'd even graduated, he was offered a position at Great Beneficence, an English dyeing and weaving company. He started there immediately upon his return to Shanghai. Zhenbao's family home was in Jiangwan, quite far from his job, and at first he stayed with some old family friends. But when his younger brother Tong Dubao finished his secondary schooling, Zhenbao made arrangements for Dubao to come and live with him, so he could help him with his studies. He wanted Dubao to take the entrance exam for the technical school that was affiliated with the Great Beneficence Dyeing and Weaving Company. They couldn't both stay at the friend's home. That would be too great an imposition. As it happened, an old classmate of Zhenbao's, Wang Shihong, had an empty room in his place. Wang Shihong had been abroad and had come back to Shanghai 2 years before Zhenbao. Now he was living in an apartment on Ferguson Road. He and Zhenbao struck a deal. The room was even furnished. On the day he was to move in, Zhenbao left work just after dusk. He and his brother were busy supervising the coolies as they carried the trunks in, and Wang Shihong was standing arms akimbo in the doorway when a woman walked in from behind. She was washing her hair, which was all lathered up with shampoo, the white curls standing high on her head like a marble sculpture. "While the workmen are here," she said to Shihong, holding her hair with her hands, "have them arrange all the furniture and things. It's no use asking our major domo to help. He'll just make excuses. If he's not in the mood, he won't do anything." "Let me introduce everyone," said Wang Shihong. "Zhenbao, Dubao, my wife. I believe you haven't met yet." The woman withdrew her hand from her hair to shake hands with the guests, but seeing the shampoo on her fingers, she hesitated. She nodded and smiled instead, then wiped her fingers on the dressing gown. A little shampoo splashed the back of Zhenbao's hand. Instead of rubbing it off, he let it dry there. The skin puckered up slightly, as if a mouth were lightly sucking at the spot. Mrs. Wang turned and went back into the other room. Zhenbao directed the workers as they moved the bed and wardrobe, but he felt troubled, and the sucking sensation was still there. His mind wandered as he headed to the bathroom to wash his hands, thinking about this Miss Wang. He'd heard that she was an overseas Chinese from Singapore, who, when she was studying in London, was quite a party girl. She and Wang Shihong got married in London, but Zhenbao had been too busy to attend the wedding. Seeing her was much better than hearing about her. Under her white shampoo-sculpted hair was a tawny gold face, the skin glistening and the flesh so firm that her eyes rose at a long upward slant, like the eyes of an actress. Her striped dressing gown, worn without a belt, hugged her body loosely, and the black and white stripes hinted at her figure, each line, each inch fully alive. People like to say that the wide, long-sleeved gowns of former times didn't flatter curvaceous beauties, but Zhenbao had just discovered that this was not the case. He turned on the faucet. The water wasn't very hot, though the water heater downstairs was certainly on, and yet the lukewarm stream seemed to have a lighted wick running through it. Twisting and winding, the water ran from the faucet, every inch of it alive, while Zhenbao's mind went running off to who knows where. Wang Shihong heard the sound of running water and came into the bathroom. "Do you want to take a bath? The water never comes up hot in this bathroom. The hot water pipe wasn't connected properly. That's the one bad thing about this apartment. If you want to wash, come into our bathroom." "Oh, no, please, don't bother," Zhenbao said. "Isn't your wife washing her hair?" "She must be finished by now. I'll go have a look." "Oh, really, it's not important." Wang Shihong went to speak with his wife, and his wife said, "I'm just finishing. Tell the ama to draw him a bath." A little later, Wang Shihong told Zhenbao to bring his soap, towel, and clothes into their bedroom. Mrs. Wang was still in front of the mirror, struggling to get a comb through her tightly permed hair. The bathroom was full of steam, and the night wind blew in through the open window. On the floor, clusters of fallen hair swirled about like ghostly figures. Zhenbao stood outside the door, holding his towel and watching the tangled hair. In the glare of the bathroom light drifting across the floor, He felt quite agitated. He liked women who were fiery and impetuous, the kind you couldn't marry. Here was one who was already a wife, and a friend's wife at that, so there couldn't be any danger. But look at this hair. It was everywhere. She was everywhere, tugging and pulling at him. The couple in the bathroom stood talking, but the water filling the tub was loud and Jianbao couldn't hear what they said. When the tub was full, they came out so he could take his bath. After his bath, Jianbao crouched down and started picking up stray hairs from the floor tiles and twisting them together. The permed hair had turned yellow at its ends. It was stiff, like fine electrical wire. He stuffed it into his pocket. His hand stayed there, and his whole body tingled. But this was too ridiculous. He extracted the hair from his pocket and tossed it into the spittoon. Carrying his soap and towel, he returned to his own room. Dubao was opening the trunks and arranging things. What kind of person could the previous tenant have been? Dubao asked. Look, here under the chair slip covers, and under the carpet here, those have got to be cigarette burns. And these marks under the table, they won't come off. Mr. Wang isn't going to blame us, is he? Of course not. They must know about it already. Besides, we're classmates from way back, so they won't be as petty as you are. Jianbao smiled. Dubao fell silent. Then he asked, Do you know who the previous tenant was? His family name is Sun, I think. He's back from England, teaching at a university now. Why do you ask? Dubao smiled before he spoke. Just now when you were gone, the major domo and the ama came to put up the curtains. They said something about not knowing how long we'll stay, and they said that Mr. Wang had wanted to kick out the man who lived here before. Mr. Wang was planning to go to Singapore on business, and he should have left a long time ago, but something happened and he got nervous. He wouldn't leave till the other fellow was out. Neither of them budged, not for 2 whole months. Jianbao told him to shush. How can you believe such nonsense? When you live in someone's house, the first rule is never to discuss the family with the servants. That only leads to trouble. Dubao didn't say anything more. A bit later, when Amma came to call them to dinner, and the brothers went into the dining room together, the cooking in the Wang household had a slightly Southeast Asian flavor. Chinese food prepared Western style, and the main dish was lamb curry. Mrs. Wang had nothing but a thin slice of toast and a piece of ham in front of her. She even cut the fatty part off the meat and gave it to her husband. Such a small appetite? Jianbao smiled. She's afraid of getting fat, said Shihong. Jianbao's face expressed disbelief. Mrs. Wang looks just right. She's not fat at all. I've just lost 5 pounds, so I'm a lot thinner than I was, she said. Shihong grinned and reached over to pinch her cheek. A lot thinner? Then what's this? His wife gave him a sharp glance. That's the London lamb I ate last year. Everyone laughed hard at this. Even though the Tong brothers and Mrs. Wang had just met for the first time, their hostess hadn't bothered to change before coming to the dinner table. She was still in her dressing gown, and her hair was still wet. A white towel was wrapped carelessly around it, and every so often the towel dripped, spangling her eyebrows. Dubao was a country boy, and Mrs. Wang's free and easy ways struck him as strange indeed. But even Jianbao found her pretty remarkable. Mrs. Wang was extremely attentive, asking all sorts of questions. She wasn't very good at keeping house, that was clear, but she did know how to entertain. I haven't had time to tell you, Shihong said to Jianbao, but I'm leaving tomorrow. I have some business in Singapore. It's good that you've moved in and can take care of things here. Mrs. Wang is very capable, Jianbao said with a smile. She'll be taking care of us, I'm sure. I very much doubt that it will be us taking care of her. Don't be fooled by her chatter, said Shihong. She doesn't understand a thing. She's been in China for 3 years now, but she still isn't used to it here, and she can't really speak Chinese well. Mrs. Wang smiled slightly and didn't disagree. She merely summoned the ama to fetch a bottle of medicine from the cabinet and poured out a spoonful. Jianbao saw the thick liquid, like white paint in the spoon, and winced. Is that cream of calcium? I've taken that before. It tastes terrible. Mrs. Wang emptied the spoon down her throat. For a moment she was speechless, but then she swallowed the medicine. It's like drinking a wall, she said. Jianbao smiled again. When Mrs. Wang talks, she hits the nail right on the head. Mr. Tong, said Mrs. Wang. Don't keep calling me Mrs. Wang. She got up and went over to a desk near the window. It's true, Junbao was thinking to himself the same. Mrs. Wang is just too commonplace. She sat at the desk, apparently writing something. Shihong went over to her, put his hand on her shoulder, and bent down to ask, You're perfectly healthy, so why are you taking doses of that? Mrs. Wang kept on writing without turning her head. The heat is rising in my system. I've got a pimple on my face. Where? Said Shihong, leaning his face close. She moved aside lightly, frowning and smiling at once. Hey there, she warned him. Dubal, raised in an old-fashioned family, had never seen a husband and wife kiss like this. He was unable to sit still and left to admire the scenery. He opened the glass door and walked onto the balcony. Junbao went on peeling an apple with a fair degree of composure, but Mrs. Wang came back to the room and thrust a piece of paper at him. There, I too have a given name, she said. The way you write Chinese characters, you shouldn't show them around, Shihong said with a smile. People will just laugh. When Junbao saw the 3 crooked words on the paper, each one bigger than the last, and the last one breaking apart into 3 distinct fragments, Wang Jiaorui, he really had to laugh. I told you people would laugh, didn't I? Shihong said with a clap of his hands. No, said Junbao, controlling himself. Really, it's a pretty name. Those overseas Chinese, the names they pick never have any style, said Shihong. Pouting, Jiaorui grabbed a piece of paper and crumpled it up. She turned on her heels and walked off, seemingly in a huff. Not 30 seconds later, she came back with an open jar of candied walnuts, which she'd already started to eat, and she offered them to Junbao and Dubao. I thought you were afraid of getting fat, laughed Shihong. It's true, said Junbao. Sweets are very fattening. You don't know about those overseas Chinese, Shihong started to say, but Jiaorui hit him. It's always they, them, those overseas Chinese, she said. Don't call me them. Shihong went right on. They have the bad habits of the Chinese and the bad habits of foreigners as well. From the foreigners, they learn to be afraid of getting fat, won't eat this, won't eat that, always taking purgatives, but can't stop eating sweets. But then go ahead, just ask her. If you ask her why she's eating this, she'll say she's had a little cough recently, and candied walnuts are good for a cough. That really is the old Chinese way, Junbao said with a smile. Anything you like to eat is, of course, good for something. Jiaorui picked up a walnut and slid it between her teeth. She pointed her little finger at Junbao. Stop that now. There really is some truth to it. To Junbao, she seemed drunk. Fearing the kind of faux pas that so often follows drink, he mumbled something inconsequential and strolled onto the balcony. The breeze was cool on his skin. Most likely his face had been pretty red a moment before. Now he was even more troubled. He just put an end to his relationship with Rose, and here she was again, in a new body with a new soul, and another man's wife. But this woman went even further than Rose. When she was in the room, the walls seemed to be covered with figures in red chalk, pictures of her half naked on the left, on the right, everywhere. Why did he keep running into this kind of woman? Was it his fault that he always reacted the way he did? Surely that couldn't be. After all, there really weren't many women of this sort, not among the pure Chinese. He'd just returned to China, so he was running with the half-Chinese, half-Western crowd. Any Chinese he met while abroad was an old friend found in a faraway land. When he returned home and saw those old friends again, the first time they met they were bosom friends, the second time mere acquaintances, and by the third time they were strangers to each other. And yet when it came to this Wang Jiaorui, hadn't Shihong done pretty well for himself by marrying her? Of course. Wang Shihong's father had money. If a man had to forge ahead on his own, as Junbao did, such a woman would be a major impediment. And he wasn't easygoing like Wang Shihong, who let a woman flout every rule. What was the point if you had to argue all day long? That was sure to sap a man's energy and drain him of ambition. Of course, she was like this precisely because her husband couldn't control her. If Wang Shihong had managed to get a handle on her, she wouldn't be quite so unruly. Zhenbao leaned on the railing, his arms folded. Down below, an electric tram with a brightly burning lamp stopped at the entrance of the building. Several people got on and off, and the lamp moved away. Wide and quiet, the street stretched beyond him. The only light was from a little restaurant on the first floor. 2 leaves skittered by in the wind like ragged shoes not worn by anyone, just walking along by themselves. So many people in the world, but they won't be coming home with you. When night fell and silence took over, or, as could happen at any time, you stood at the brink of death, there in the dark you needed a wife you really loved. Otherwise there would be nothing but loneliness. Zhenbao didn't think this through clearly, but he was overwhelmed by a sense of foreboding. The next day, when Zhenbao came back from work and pressed the doorbell, Jiao Rui opened the door, phone receiver in hand. It was dim in the hallway, which made it hard to see, but Shihong's hat and coat were gone from the coat rack, along with the leather suitcase that had been under the rack. He must have left already. Taking off his coat and hanging it on the rack, Zhenbao heard Jiao Rui dial a phone number in the other room. "Please ask Mr. Sun to come to the phone," she said. Zhenbao listened. He heard her ask, "Is this Timmy?" "No, I'm not going out today. I'm at home waiting for a boyfriend." She started to giggle. "Who is he?" "I'm not telling you. Why should I tell you?" "Oh, so you're not interested? Not even interested in yourself, are you?" "Anyway, I'm waiting for him to come for tea at 5 o'clock. I'm waiting specially for him, so don't come over." Zhenbao went to his room without waiting for her to finish. His brother wasn't there, or in the bathroom either. He went out to see if he was on the balcony, and Jiao Rui emerged from the living room to greet him. "Du Bao asked me to tell you that he's making the rounds of the used bookstores to see if he can find some books." "Oh, thank you," said Zhenbao. He took a good long look. She was wearing a long dress that trailed to the floor, a dress of such intense, fresh, and wet green that anything it touched turned the same color. When she moved a little, the air was streaked with green. The dress had been cut a bit too small, it seemed. The seams along the side were split open 1.5 inches, then laced together in a crisscross pattern over a green satin strip that didn't fully cover a startling pink slip. Looked at too long, these eye-popping colors would prove blinding. Only Jiao Rui could wear a dress like that with such utter insouciance. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, turning back into the living room. She sat down at the table and lifted the pot to pour the tea. The table was set for 2, with a plate of butter biscuits and toast. Zhenbao stood by the glass door. "Isn't there a guest coming?" "We won't wait for him. Let's go ahead and have something to eat." Zhenbao hesitated, unable to figure out what she had in mind. Then, just for the time being, he sat down. "Do you take milk?" Jiao Rui asked. "Either way." "Oh, that's right. You like green tea. You were abroad so many years and couldn't get it there. That's what you said yesterday." "You have a good memory." Getting up to ring the bell, Jiao Rui threw him a glance. "No, you don't know. Usually my memory is terrible." Zhenbao's heart jumped, and he was knocked off balance. The ama came in. "Make 2 cups of green tea," Jiao Rui ordered. "Ask her to bring another teacup and plate while she's at it," said Zhenbao, "for the guest who's coming later." Jiao Rui gave him a sharp look. "Who's this guest that you're so anxious about?" "Ama, bring me a pen and piece of paper, please." She dashed off a note, then pushed it across to Zhenbao. 2 lines, simple and succinct. "Dear Timmy, so very sorry, but I have something to do today. I've gone out. Jiao Rui." She folded the paper over and gave it to the ama. "Mr. Sun will come in a little while. When he does, give this to him and tell him I'm not home." The ama went out. Zhenbao took a biscuit. "I don't understand you," he said. "Why go to so much trouble asking a man to come to your house, then turn him away empty-handed?" Jiao Rui leaned forward, carefully considering the selection of biscuits on the plate, but she couldn't find any that she liked. "When I asked him to come, I didn't plan to turn him away." "Oh, a last-minute decision?" "Don't you know the saying? It's a woman's prerogative to change her mind." The ama brought the green tea. leaves floating all over the surface of the water. Jianbao held the glass in both hands without drinking. His eyes were fixed on the tea, but his mind was elsewhere, working things out. Jiao Rui was still carrying on with that Mr. Sun behind her husband's back, and evidently she was worried that Jianbao would see what was going on. That's why she'd put on this sweet act today. She wanted to win him over so he'd keep his mouth shut. But in fact, Jianbao had no intention of interfering with their private lives. It wasn't that his bond with Wang Shihong was too weak. Even if they'd been blood brothers, stirring up disputes between husband and wife was not his style. Even so, this woman could cause a lot of trouble. Jianbao redoubled his caution. Jiao Rui set down her tea glass and rose to get a jar of peanut butter from the cabinet. I'm a trashy person. I like to eat trashy things. Oh my, this stuff is very rich, very fattening. Jiao Rui took off the lid. I love breaking the rules. Don't you approve of rule breaking? Jianbao put his hand on top of the glass jar. No. Jiao Rui hesitated for a long moment. Then she said, How about this? You put some on the bread for me. I'm sure you won't give me too much. Her expression was so pitiful that he couldn't help laughing. Jianbao spread peanut butter on the bread. Jiao Rui watched him closely over the edge of her cup, pursed her lips, and laughed. Do you know why I had you do it for me? If I did it myself, all of a sudden I might turn conscientious and spread it as thin as possible. But I know that you'd feel bad if you only gave me a little. At this, they both laughed. Unable to resist Jiao Rui's childlike charm, Jianbao gradually softened. As they were drinking their tea, the doorbell sounded. Jianbao got restless. For the third time now, he asked, Is that the guest you invited? Don't you feel embarrassed? Jiao Rui shrugged. Taking his glass with him, Jianbao went out to the balcony. When he comes back through the door, I want to see the kind of person he is. Him? Said Jiao Rui, following behind. Very pretty. Too pretty. You don't like pretty men? Said Jianbao, leaning against the railing. Men should not be pretty. Men get spoiled even more easily than women do. Jianbao lowered his eyelids, then looked at her. You shouldn't talk about others, he said with a smile. You've been terribly spoiled. Maybe, but you're just the opposite. You deny yourself when in fact you like to eat and play around just as much as I do. Really? Jianbao laughed. And you know all about it. Jiao Rui looked down and started picking tea leaves out of her glass. She kept picking away until at last she took a sip. Jianbao too drank his tea in silence. A little while later, a man in a western suit came out of the building. Jianbao couldn't see much from the third floor, but it looked like the man rushed around the corner, his body tense with anger. Poor guy, Jianbao couldn't help saying. He came all this way for nothing. So what? He has nothing to do all day long. I too have nothing to do, but I have no respect for people like me. What I like most is to wrest a bit of time from a man who's already very busy, the way a tiger seizes its prey. Pretty despicable, don't you think? Jianbao was leaning against the railing. He tapped his foot against the railing, and then, bit by bit, not entirely intentionally, he started kicking at a rattan chair. When the chair shook, the flesh on her arm trembled slightly. She wasn't fat at all, but because of her small frame, she seemed plump. So, you like busy men? Jianbao smiled. Jiao Rui hid her eyes with her hand. Actually, it doesn't matter. My heart's an apartment. So, is there an empty room for rent? Jiao Rui didn't answer. I'm not used to living in an apartment. I want to live in a single-family house. She gave a little grunt of disbelief. Well, she said, let's see if you can tear one down and build the other. Jianbao gave her chair a good hard kick. Just watch me. Jiao Rui took her hand from her eyes and gave him a long look. You're wicked. Can't help myself with you. Come on, be serious, Jiao Rui said. Why don't you tell me something about your past? What past? Jiao Rui's leg swept out, almost spilling the tea in his hand. Faker, I already know all about it. If you know, why ask? Wouldn't it be better if you told me something about your past? My past? She leaned her head to one side and rubbed her cheek on her shoulder. After a long moment's silence, she softly said, There isn't much to tell. There was another long silence. Well then, please tell, Jianbao urged. But Jiao Rui fell into thought and said nothing, her eyes fixed straight ahead. How did you and Shihong meet? He asked. In a very ordinary way, she said. The student associations hold a meeting in London. I was a representative, and so was he. Were you at the University of London? My family sent me to London to study, but the real reason was to find a suitable husband. I was quite young and had no wish at all to get married, but I used this as an excuse to escape from home and have a good time. After a few years of having a good time, my reputation wasn't all that good, so I looked around and grabbed this Shihong fellow. Jianbao kicked her chair lightly. And you still haven't had enough of the good times? It's not a question of having enough or not. Once you've learned to do something, you can't just put it aside and give it up. Don't forget that you're in China now, Jianbao said with a smile. Jiao Rui finished her tea in one swallow, stood, and spat the tea leaves over the railing. In China, you have Chinese freedoms. You can spit on the street if you want. The doorbell rang again, and Jianbao guessed that it was his brother. It was in fact Du Bao, and now that he was back, things took a different turn.